Our next speaker this afternoon will be Mackenzie Strong. Mackenzie is the curatorial assistant in decorative arts and design at the Cincinnati Art Museum, which is a place near and dear to my heart. She's also a champion of all things Cincinnati, having gifted many of us cans of Skyline chili, which I definitely advise trying. It's delightful. She will be speaking, or she has her master's in history from the University of Edinburgh. And she will be speaking today, Reframing Adam Boyd, the lived experience and representation in an 18th century portrait. Mackenzie, come on up.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Leah, and thank you everyone for being here. Imagine for a moment that we are in the late 18th century room where this figure, Adam Boyd, sits for a portrait. In front of us, we see the sitter, the artist, and the materials. A few sheets of paper, possibly some linen fabric, an easel, and pastels rolled up into crayons. As the artist prepares these materials, we might take in our surroundings, letting our eyes adjust to the dim lighting. The windows have been mostly darkened, allowing for the artist to focus the limited light on brightening the sitter's face. At this point, we may shift our gaze to the artist, noticing how they use charcoal and perforations to transfer the sitter's outline shape from a rough sketch to the paper they will use for the portrait itself. The artist might take a seat, cradling their box of pastels in their lap. They are ready to begin the painting process. We might watch closely as the artist deftly wields crayons in varying hues to capture the sitter's likeness, beginning with the subject's face and working out to the background. As we observe the artist's considered movements and intentional color placements, we may be lulled into a contemplative state by the soft sounds of the pastels connecting with the paper and the pads of the artist's fingers expertly blending the colors together to form a seamless image. Allowing our thoughts and our gaze to drift, we might turn our attention to the sitter. As we do, we may begin to develop some questions about the subject of this portrait, namely, who is Adam Boyd and why has he chosen this moment to have an artist produce his image? This afternoon, back in the 21st century, I will explore these questions of identity and representation by closely contextualizing Boyd's 18th century portrait and analyzing his numerous identities using newspaper articles, letters, and official records. Ultimately, I hope to reframe our understanding of both Boyd the person and Boyd the portrait by grappling with the tensions between his lived experiences and his representation in this object that has outlived Boyd himself by more than 2 centuries. Before we can start contextualizing Boyd the person, we need to begin by taking a closer look at Boyd the portrait. In this pastel painting, the now unknown artist presented the white male figure of Boyd from a profile view using a muted color scheme, mainly taupes, browns, grays, off-white, cream, and a bit of navy blue. The artist centered Boyd within the paper and created a relatively simple background. Looking at the portrait, my eyes are instantly drawn to Boyd's stoic, slightly rounded face, which seems to be the brightest part of the image. The artist ensured that the sitter's face remained the focal point of the image by contrasting its brightness with a deep charcoal background. The artist depicted Boyd with gray hair that falls in slight curls around his face and neck and is tied in the back with what appears to be a piece of fabric. Boyd wears a uniform-like blue coat that features a cream facing along the collar and lapel, gold buttons, and a white neck stock. In fact, a newspaper advertisement from November 1775 provided a similar description of one uniform worn by soldiers in the Continental Army during the American Revolution. These possible references to a military uniform are only heightened by the date inscribed along the bottom edge of the paper, 1776. When I first met Adam Boyd the portrait, he was enclosed by glass and yellow pine in a lightly carved frame that had been stained this rich brown color upon its arrival at the museum in 1977. Although I had started the process of close looking while the portrait remained in its frame, I quickly realized that in order to enhance my understanding of the object, I first needed to unframe Adam Boyd. Once we had separated Boyd the portrait from its frame, with careful help supplied by Leah and Dr. Ackerman, I found that I was able to see the image from an entirely different perspective. Unframed, I could more readily see the details within the image. I noticed that the diagonal strokes of the artist's hand are still visible in the charcoal pastel that covers the left side of the portrait's background. Fine lines around Boyd's eye, cheek, and nose also became more evident without the filter of glass. Additionally, unframing Boyd the portrait afforded me a better angle from which I could read the full inscription. Adam Boyd, 1st North Carolina Regiment, 1776. According to Mesda's files, Boyd's portrait was created by a now unknown artist in Wilmington, North Carolina in 1776. Although answers about the artist's identity remain elusive, expertise from Katie McKinney, the Margaret Beck Pritchard Associate Curator of Maps and Prints at Colonial Williamsburg, and Neil Hurst, the Associate Curator of Costume and Textiles at Colonial Williamsburg, has revealed that this portrait was likely made later than 1776, probably in the final decade of the 18th century. Katie initially suspected a later date after looking at the eye featured in the portrait, and after a few minutes and messages, Neil came to a similar conclusion based on the stand and fall collar of Boyd's jacket, which likely dated it to a period later than 1776. This in turn alters both the location where the portrait was likely made and the possible reasons behind the creation of Boyd's image, as we will explore later. In order to reframe Adam Boyd, I next had to start putting together the pieces of a new frame for Boyd the portrait. This required me to explore and complicate the various identities of Boyd the person. Little information has yet been discovered about the first few decades of Adam Boyd's life. According to his main biographer, Durward Stokes, Boyd was born in Pennsylvania in 1738 and worked alongside his brother in New Providence and Somersville, Bermuda before 1760. After he moved to Wilmington, North Carolina in the 1760s, Boyd became a relatively traceable figure in the historical record as a newspaper publisher, a military figure in the American Revolution, and a minister during his final 2 decades of life. Indeed, the title of his key biography succinctly sums up his identity as publisher, preacher, and patriot. Although an unparalleled source of information on Boyd, the story of his life is far more nuanced. Exploring Adam Boyd's role as a publisher best helps us more fully contextualize Boyd the person. Specifically, Boyd's newspaper, the Cape Fear Mercury, provides essential insight into Boyd the person's active participation in the political and economic development of early America. As previously mentioned, Boyd established himself in Wilmington in the 1760s. He eventually purchased the necessary printing equipment from former Wilmington printer Andrew Stewart, and by 1769, Boyd established the Cape Fear Mercury as a weekly newspaper. Throughout the first few years of publication, it appears that Boyd's political loyalty remained with Britain. Visually, Boyd linked each issue of the Cape Fear Mercury with British rule by printing the royal crest atop each front page. The content of Boyd's paper similarly reflected these British connections. However, Boyd's political allegiances shifted somewhere between May 11th, 1774 and July 28th, 1775. Indeed, by July 1775, Boyd removed the royal crest from his paper. Furthermore, Boyd also aligned the content of the Mercury with the American revolutionists. Boyd apparently used his newspaper to contribute to the political tensions of the period, and the remaining extant copies help us better nuance Boyd's identity as a printer whose political ideas seem to have evolved over the years. 18th century newspapers were also integral to economic development in the American colonies, and Boyd's newspaper was no exception. Exploring the economic ties of Boyd's press similarly allows us to better complicate our understanding of his identity as a printer, specifically regarding Boyd's role in upholding systems of enslavement. On a personal level, Boyd undeniably profited from enslaved labor. His wife, Mary Ivy, whom Boyd married in 1774, had previously been married to and had 2 surviving children with a Dr. Moses John DeRosset. When Boyd married into this family, they appear to have been financially supported by the DeRosset familial inheritance that included 17 enslaved individuals. Indeed, we can see in Mary's will from 1798 her explicit bequest of 2 enslaved persons to her 2 grandsons, while the rest of Mary's estate was to be divided between her son and daughter. This self-sufficiency of his family, which rested in part on the work of enslaved laborers, seemingly allowed Boyd a measure of freedom in his own occupational pursuits. Boyd also used his position as a newspaper publisher to uphold systems of enslavement and possibly to participate directly in enslaving practices. As publisher of the Cape Fear Mercury, Boyd the Person helped preserve the institution of enslavement in the colony by publishing countless advertisements from enslavers offering rewards for information regarding or the re-enslavement of self-emancipated individuals. Beyond these contributions to sustaining enslavement in the colony, Boyd the Person may have played an even more active role. In the existing copies of the Mercury, 4 advertisements about possible transactions involving enslaved persons are attributed to either A. Boyd or the printer. 2 of these advertisements suggest that Boyd may have occasionally hired enslaved laborers. The other 2 adverts possibly involve Boyd in the trade of and purchase of enslaved persons. Substantial additional research needs to be done to firmly connect Boyd the Person with such direct participation in systems of enslavement. Regardless, as we reframe Adam Boyd, it is essential to understand how he used his role as a printer to participate in the political and economic life of the colony and emergent nation. The complexity of Adam Boyd's identities extended beyond that of his role as newspaperman. Indeed, in the latter half of his life, we see Boyd the Person undertake both military and ministerial positions. These 2 facets of Boyd's identity often appear to be intertwined. By January 1776, Boyd enlisted as an ensign in the 1st North Carolina Regiment during the American Revolution. Awareness of this aspect of Boyd's identity is inescapable when we study Boyd the portrait, especially given the inscription on the front of the object. Officially, Boyd apparently served the regiment in additional positions throughout the years, including as judge advocate and chaplain. Unofficially, Boyd seemed to operate under a much more extensive job description in his role as chaplain, based on his wartime correspondence. At various times in this role, Boyd also seemingly served as provisioner, government liaison, and intelligence officer. Understanding this dynamism of Boyd's role as military chaplain provides an essential framework for exploring the tensions between lived experience and representation in his portrait. After the war, Adam Boyd's life retained much of its complexity, but may have lost its dynamic quality, according to Boyd himself. In the years immediately following the war, Boyd the Person returned to Wilmington, where he continued to receive pay for his military service and eventually found occasional work as a minister. Over the next decade and a half, Boyd's ministerial work, along with his increasingly deteriorating health, took him away from Wilmington and his family and moved him throughout the South. Despite these frequent relocations, one letter from Boyd in 1800 suggests that he recognized a lack of meaningful activity in his ministerial life. Writing from Nashville, Tennessee, Boyd lamented very much that he can so seldom declare the word of God in public and used writing to occupy his time instead. While living in Tennessee, Boyd's military and ministerial occupations once again collided when he delivered a memorial sermon to honor George Washington's legacy. Less than a year later, a local newspaper published a notice that detailed Boyd's imminent departure in a boat for the Mississippi Territory, which would become Boyd's final residence before his death around 1803. Now that we have complicated Adam Boyd the Person, I want us to return our attention to Boyd the portrait, to reframe this object within the context of Boyd's lived experiences. When we look at Boyd the portrait as a historical object, 2 main questions that we are likely to formulate are, why was this the most fitting moment in which to capture Boyd's likeness, and why was he represented in this manner? Drawing through lines to Boyd's personal life offers up some suggestions in answer. If we understand the portrait to have been made around the 1790s, This means that Boyd likely would have been living near Augusta, Georgia, and working as a minister when his image was created. His name appears on this 1800 property tax record for Richmond County in Georgia, and Boyd's own correspondence places him in Augusta as early as 1789. At this time, Boyd was also living apart from his family, and his letter suggests that he was keenly aware of the distance between them. In this letter to his stepdaughter, Magdalene Mary, Boyd writes that he has long wished to return to see her, but that his wishes have been impracticable. Perhaps this was the appropriate moment for an artist to create this portrait of Boyd for one personal reason. Even while serving in the military, Boyd appears to have had several opportunities to travel to and from home based on his letters and an official military petition. Maybe Boyd the portrait was ultimately created to provide a distant family this tangible connection to and memory of Boyd the person. This idea of Boyd the portrait becoming a family memento becomes especially persuasive when we consider questions about the object's preservation. This answer is purely speculative based on the resources available now, but it nevertheless helps us contextualize why this object might have been created in this specific moment. The influence of nostalgia might also help us hypothesize answers to the question of representation, specifically in the connection between this image and the American Revolution. In the final years of his life, Boyd seemingly remembered the revolutionary period through a rose-tinted lens. In 1800, he opened his discourse memorializing George Washington with a poem. The first stanza read, "All hail the glorious day, when the new world a flag unfurled, and with her native band redeemed the oppressed land, and drove the tyrants back in deep dismay." Additionally, as we have already seen, Boyd's wartime letters suggest that he was constantly in action and insinuate that Boyd himself saw his role in the war effort as multidimensional. This representation of Adam Boyd, which seems to be entirely focused on the military aspect of his identity, may reveal Boyd's own perception of his height of usefulness as a military figure working to help direct the emergent nation. Other extenuating factors likely influenced how Boyd was depicted in this portrait. Profile portraits, for example, were an increasingly popular and accessible commodity in the late 18th century, as artists like Charles Balthazar Julien Fevret de Saint-Mémin developed machines and techniques to produce greater quantities of profiles at a lower cost. Ideas about democracy and accuracy also became attached to profile images, further nuancing the representational choices in Boyd's portrait. Furthermore, the Greco-Roman or classical influences associated with profile portraiture throughout the 18th century likely also contributed to this representation of Boyd. As we focus more closely on the connections between this portrait and Boyd's lived experiences, a contradictory tension becomes evident between Boyd's self-perception and the representation of him in this object. One recurring awareness seems to be shared across Boyd's identities: concern about his financial status. As a printer, we see Boyd partly relying upon a third party to assist him in garnering subscribers to the newspaper. Additionally, we see him publish an address to his subscribers, reminding them of their required payment in multiple issues. As a soldier, we read in Boyd's own words about his self-perceived financial difficulties in reference to acquiring necessary regimental provisions. "Had I or could I command the money, I really would most cheerfully advance it, but few continental chaplains are so rich." Finally, financial anxieties seem to resonate throughout Boyd's documents during his career as a minister. These self-professed financial woes seem to be at odds with the very fact that a portrait of Boyd was created in the first place, let alone survive for more than 200 years. Although one of the more economical high-style art options, pastels became increasingly popular, partly due to their rising acceptability as a female domestic pursuit, and increasingly expensive in the 18th century. Another aspect of Boyd's lived experience appears to be in tension with the existence of his portrait, that of his interstate relocations. As we've seen, Boyd lived in at least 4 regions after 1776: North Carolina, Georgia, Tennessee, and Mississippi. If the portrait was created in the 1790s while Boyd lived in Augusta, Georgia, and remained with him, the object would have had to endure 2 moves, one of which appears to have been by boat. Pastels are an incredibly fragile medium, Their delicacy did not lend them to display in public or high-traffic spaces, let alone to river transportation. Ultimately, these evident tensions between Boyd's lived experience and his representation in such a long-lived object leaves us with two essential and currently inconclusive questions. Did Adam Boyd commission this portrait? And how was this object preserved for more than 2 centuries? Over the past 20 minutes, we've explored the various ways in which we can metaphorically reframe both Adam Boyd the person and Adam Boyd the portrait. On the one hand, Boyd the person led a multifaceted life that required and requires even further nuance. Boyd the printer seemingly was keenly aware of and involved in the political and economic development of early America. Boyd the soldier likewise apparently embraced numerous opportunities to contribute to the work and well-being of the regiment. Boyd the minister reflected an apparent melancholy about the decreased activity available to him at this time. On the other hand, Boyd the portrait fails to reflect his multidimensional identity on the surface. Instead, Boyd seemingly chose to represent himself in the form that he likely linked to a greater self-perception of usefulness, that of soldier. Complicating Boyd the person was essential to understanding the tensions between lived experience and representation in Boyd the portrait. With this foundation, we are able to read these tensions through the lenses of nostalgia and projection of status, self-perception, and one very particular part of Boyd's identity. Now that we've started to ideologically reframe Adam Boyd as both portrait and person, all Boyd the portrait needs now is a new physical frame. Thank you.